Once upon a time, there lived a man who got married to a quiet and successful woman. His name was Chijuke, and his wife, Norma, was a renowned mechanical engineer in an oil servicing company in Lagos. Not many women thrived as engineers, but Norma broke every stereotype with quiet confidence. Her mind was sharper than a welding torch, and she earned the respect of many who admired not only her work but her brilliance. A first class graduate from one of the most prestigious universities in the country, Norma's name often came up in conversations among industry giants. She was the type of woman whose silence spoke louder than words, never one to boast, yet every accomplishment clung to her like a medal. When she married Chijoke, many whispered behind closed doors. She could have done better, they said behind her back, when they realized that her husband was a school dropout, a man who had dropped out of polytechnic after 2 failed semesters and now spent most of his days sitting at home doing nothing. He had no drive, no ambition, and no dream, but he had charm. And more importantly, he had mastered the art of preying on successful women with gentle hearts. He made it his mission to marry a woman who would never challenge his fragile ego, a woman who would work tirelessly, hand over her salary, and remain submissive, grateful even that he married her. And Unoma fit into this category. She was 42 and desperate for marriage. Despite her brilliance and success, Unoma found it hard to find a man. Her desperation for marriage chased many away, even before they got to truly know her. Unoma, at a point in her life, proposed to a man after just one date. She even bought a car for a man, hoping to keep him in her life, but the man took the car and married her mate, who worked for her at the time. Norma was so devastated. She could not believe how her old man would dump her for her mate. It was a roller coaster of emotion, shame, and heartbreak. Norma had spent years pouring herself into her work, building a name that echoed in engineering halls as well as offshore conferences. But when it came to love, she felt like a perpetual failure. The world clapped for her brilliance, whilst others mocked her loneliness. All her sisters were married, including her last sister, who was 15 years younger than she was. The wedding had broken something inside of her. Although she smiled through it all and danced as the big sister of the bride, people found subtle ways to rub her singleness in her face. They asked questions and threw subtle shades at her. "Ah, engineer, book no be husband o," one said, as she implied that Unoma was too picky, and that was why she had remained single. She began to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were right. Maybe love wasn't for women like her, women so successful, with huge bank accounts and certificates on every wall. So, when Chijuke came along, they didn't even have to try. He only needed to do what others never did: stay. He listened, smiled, told her that she was special, and that real men don't fear successful women. That was all it took, and within months, Norma was swept into a whirlwind of romance. She introduced him to her colleagues, fronted him to her family, and defended him when they asked if she was really sure that she wanted to marry him. Norma did not care that he was an illiterate. She did not care that she funded her entire wedding with her own money. All Chijuke had to do on that day was show up, and that was enough for her. Her family, especially her mother, looked on with forced joy, knowing deep down that this man did not match the weight of the woman that he was marrying. Whilst everyone worried, Norma jubilated at the thought of finally being chosen. She smiled so brightly that day, as her eyes sparkled with a kind of joy that only women who had waited too long could understand. It wasn't about perfection. It was about relief. Relief that she would no longer be pitied at weddings. Relief that she could finally say "my husband" in conversations and not feel like an outsider in her own age group. So she celebrated, she danced, she glowed, but deep in her mother's heart sat a storm. She had raised Norma to be a lioness, and now she was watching her hand her life over to a fox in borrowed feathers. The marriage began like any other, sweet, loving and perfect to say the least. Chijuki called her my queen every morning. He kissed her forehead. He said the grace over every meal that she prepared. He told her how lucky he was to have her. But 3 months in, the cracks began to show. Chijuki turned Norma into his money-making machine. He took control of her money, claiming that she belonged to him, which meant that all she had now belonged to him. Chijuki forced her to put her house and cars in his name, threatening that if she failed to do so, he would end their marriage and move on. Norma had to give in, as she could not risk her marriage ending because of material possessions. She did all this for him. Despite her brilliance and exposure, Norma was willing to do anything to save her marriage. At 42, she saw her husband as a crown on her head, the man who wiped shame from her face by marrying her. Despite knowing that she was far older, she could not have a child, but yet he still chose to marry her, and Norma was not willing to do anything that would jeopardize their marriage. She sacrificed her salary, her voice, and even her dignity just to ensure that she remained married. She excused the constant insults from her husband and justified the slaps, blaming herself whenever he even cheated on her. One evening, Norma returned home tired and exhausted. She had stopped by the salon area to change her hair, which she had carried for almost 2 months. Her husband was in the living room with his friends when she walked in to meet them seated. After a brief conversation with them, she excused herself and walked into the room. Ojuku, one of her husband's friends, joked about how Chijoke had no control over his wife. How can you allow your wife to make her hair without your permission? Can you see how long those braids are? He said to Chijuke, who sat there quietly, his ego twisted in the heat of the laughter. The men laughed as they continued to mock his wife. She looks like the man of the house, while you look like the woman, Ojuku said, as they all laughed at Chijuke, who sat there fuming in anger. He had no education, no job, no ambition, no respect from these men, only tolerance, because they know that his wife had money. Chijuke in that moment knew that the only way he could maintain their admiration was to prove control, even if it meant proving it on her body. So, when Norma came out moments later, he stood up and called her to the center of the room. Turn around, he said casually to Norma, who looked at him confused as she turned around. Who asked you to do this here? He asked Norma, who replied politely, saying that she didn't think that she needed to seek his permission before making her hair. Ojuku tried to hold back his laughter as Chijuki burst out in anger and began to yell at her. He had to show his friends that he was in control. So, he gave her a very hot slap across her face and pulled out the lighter from his pocket and set her braids on fire. The flame caught instantly as Norma began to scream at the top of her voice. The entire room went wild as the smell of burning hair filled the air. Norma dropped to the ground as she tried to put it out, but the fire kept burning as she rushed to the bathroom and poured a bucket of water over herself. Luckily, the fire did not get to her scalp. Norma stood in the mirror shaking as she watched her life flash before her eyes. In that moment, Norma saw herself for what she had become, a woman who had given up everything, her name, her power, her brilliance, for a man who born her just to prove a point. And not a single one of his friends stopped him. They all sat there frozen as she fought for her dear life. Norma, in that moment, knew that it was enough. She could not believe that a woman like her, who was highly respected by men of caliber, was now being ridiculed by a man she stooped too low to marry. A broke and lazy illiterate, with no ambition or dream. Norma could not believe how she let herself take all this nonsense, all in the name of preserving her marriage. A marriage where her husband cheated on her at every given opportunity. A marriage where she paid for everything and handed her salary over to her husband. A marriage where all that she benefits from her husband is a title of Mrs. For all these years, she walked on eggshells, all because she was scared of being alone. She stared at her reflection and wept, knowing that she did this to herself. Norma, in that moment, woke up, not gently, not gradually but violently. She arrived in the living room and met Chijioke, who was now laughing with his friends. "Get out of my house now," she said angrily, as they all turned to her and began to laugh. Chijioke stood up majestically to remind her that the house was now in his name. "If anyone is to leave this house, it's you," he said to Norma, who stood there for some minutes silent as she walked back into the house. "She thinks because I'm an illiterate that I'm senseless," he said to his friends, who all laughed and hailed him for being so sharp. They all sat there as Norma returned to the living room, where Chijioke and his hyena-hearted friends still laughed. She stood in the center of the room and raised an envelope high like a final sermon. "This," she said, her voice cold and clear. "This is the original copy of the house deed, complete with my name, my initials, my lawyer's stamp and my signature. Not yours, Chijioke," she said as their laughter died instantly. Norma opened the envelope and held up the document for all to see. "You thought I changed the name to yours?" she asked Chijioke, who watched her explain that the document he signed was a document stating that he has no right over any of her properties, including her cars and houses. "You thought you were smart," Norma said as she took a step closer, her eyes locked to Chijioke, who sat there stunned. "You thought you were smart," she repeated. "No, Chijioke, I was the smart one. The day you bullied me into signing over my assets, you signed a legal disclaimer. That paper, yes, the one you signed, without reading, was prepared by my lawyer. You relinquished any claim to my properties the moment you signed that document." Chijioke stood up sharply as anger surged through his body. Norma turned around and tossed the document he signed at him. "Read it." "Oh, wait, you can't because you're an illiterate," she said as Ojukwu and the others stared at her in awkward silence. The mockery in their eyes had now shifted. The tide had finally turned as Chijioke's friends began to pity him. "The house is mine. The car's mine. Every account you siphoned, already frozen. My account officer made sure of it a few minutes ago. As I speak, divorce papers are on their way to your mother's house, since you still use that address for everything." "You can't do this to me," he said fearfully, as Norma revealed to him that she knows it all. The fact that he had a wife in the village and 2 children. The fact that he deceived her into marriage to scam her of her money and disappear. Norma paid a private investigator to investigate her husband when she saw a suspicious message pop up on his phone one night while he was asleep. It was a woman's name, saved as church sister. But the message read, "The children miss you. When are you coming back home?" That was the beginning of her awakening. So, she hired an investigator secretly, and within a week, she had photos, documents, even baptism certificates of his children who were aged 3 and 6. He wasn't just a lazy man. He was a fraud, a seasoned manipulator who had done this before to another woman, his first wife in the village, whom he abandoned after promising her that he was traveling to Lagos for work. Norma threw the printed photos at him, one by one, like evidence in court. "Tell them who really owns you, Chijioke," she said. "Tell your friends how you played me, just like you played your village wife." The room fell into deep, uneasy silence. Ojukwu, the loudest of them all, stood up and muttered something underneath his breath as he made for the door. The rest followed like scattered rats because no one wanted to be associated with a man whose lies had finally caught up with him. Chijioke stood there, shoulders slumped, face pale, stripped of the only power he had left, deception. But Norma was not done. She picked up her phone and made a single call. "Yes, officer, he's ready." Exactly 10 minutes later, the police arrived. Not only had Chijioke signed over his rights unknowingly, but Norma's legal team had gathered enough evidence of financial abuse, identity fraud, and bigamy to have him arrested. As they placed handcuffs on him, Chijioke screamed, "You can't do this to me. I'm your husband." But Norma stood tall in the doorway and replied coldly, "No, Chijioke, you are a project, and your deadline has expired." As he was dragged out of the house, she didn't even blink. She simply turned, walked inside and shut the door. Not just the wooden door before her, but every open door inside her that ever gave room to shame, desperation, and the idea that being loved meant being used. That night, Norma sat in her bedroom alone. She picked up her phone and made a call to her mother, telling her all that had happened. "I'm coming home tomorrow, Mama. I need to rest," she said to her mother, who told her that she was always welcome home. Her mother, who had waited years to hear her daughter sound like herself again, wept bitterly as she could not believe that the happiness she felt was because her daughter was finally out of bondage. Norma sat in her room alone, enjoying the silence, the kind that comes when a woman reclaims her name after being put down for far too long. Her scalp still stung, her heart still ached, but something inside her had healed. She walked back to the mirror and smiled, not because it was over, but because she had finally remembered who she truly was. A lioness who was never meant to bow to a goat. A woman who had found her voice in the fire. And from that day on, Norma never let herself fall for the pressures of society again. She stopped defining her worth by the presence of a man in her life. She stopped shrinking her brilliance just to suit someone else's insecurity. She wore her scars like medals and built her confidence, knowing that one day she would find a man who would truly love and cherish her, not one who saw her as a means to an end. The lessons to be learned from this story is that no woman should ever sacrifice her dignity just to bear the title Mrs. Marriage should never cost you your peace, identity, or safety, no matter how late love seems to come. Settling for someone who belittles your worth is greater tragedy. A successful woman is not too much. She simply needs someone who isn't too little. Because in the end, it's better to be alone and whole than married and broken. I hope you enjoyed the story.